I'm now going to discuss victimology, which is a consideration of why did Douglas Harris get selected to be a victim of a violent crime? Did he know his offender? What risks did the offender take to carry out this crime? If you answer those questions, you get a better understanding of who might have killed Douglas Harris. I did do a search of Douglas Harris's criminal records. He did have a history of criminal behavior while intoxicated. He had been arrested at least once in 1947 when he was found drunk in a stranger's home up on Lake Street, and he would not leave, and the Norwich police took him to the station, and then by their account, he resisted them and there was a fight. Similarly, also in 1947, he was arrested by the Connecticut State Police. He had gone to a woman's house outside the city of Norwich, banged on her door. The records indicate this was an African-American woman. When she would not open the door, he broke the window. The Connecticut State Police came to Norwich, asked for the Norwich Police's help. They arrested him. So my conclusion was that when he was drinking, Harris had a history of fighting and disorderly conduct. I should also say that when he was sober, Douglas Harris had good qualities. He was very helpful to Gladys. He showed her sympathy when a lot of other people in the neighborhood looked down upon her because she had certain orthopedic problems. But when he actually started imbibing, negative parts of his personality would come out. So I started looking at possible suspects, and the first thing I looked at is whether he could have been killed by some drinking associates he met in town. It's a logical possibility. The problem you face there is if Douglas Harris was killed at a bar, why would they have transported him all the way back to his house and put him down the well in a pouring rain? It would have been difficult to do under such circumstances, and it would have also risked discovery. So it was not it's not a logical explanation. He was over 200 pounds, moving him from the car 150 plus feet up to the well would have been difficult. I do not think his body was moved a great distance after he was attacked. Possible suspects, the Ku Klux Klan or some other group of racially motivated extremists. The problem with this theory is there's no surviving evidence that the KKK was active in Norwich in 1948. I went through the yearly indexes of the Norwich Bulletin from 1930 to 1960, which would report what happened every day as a lead news story. And I didn't find any reporting of any such rallies, gatherings, hate campaigns. This doesn't mean that there were no present or former members of the Ku Klux Klan in Norwich. It just means that if they existed, they were operating far under the radar. In other words, they didn't want to be in the paper. They were not out drawing attention to themselves. I also interviewed about 25 people who were living in Norwich at the time and asked them if they were aware of any KKK activities during that time, 1940s, 1950s. No one had a solid lead on any such activities. It's possible that they were out conducting get-togethers at private farms in Norwich, but once again, you would have to assume Douglas Harris was killed by such an extremist group, you have to assume that it came out of nowhere. That's one of the reasons why the police report I referred to earlier was interesting. Douglas Harris was not pursuing white women. That would have greatly changed his risk factor in Norwich at the time. I did find out who was the last known leader of the Ku Klux Klan in Norwich. It was a guy named G. Warren Davis, but he died in 1936. He was age 70. He had been one of the main organizers in the 1920s. So without finding some sort of lead, without finding even verified threat against Douglas Harris, which preceded his murder, it's very difficult for me to sit here and tell you that Douglas Harris was murdered by white extremists when there is no surviving evidence of that occurring. Assuming Douglas Harris was murdered, his death was made to look like an accident. In extremist killings, there tend to be two patterns. Either A, they leave the body out in public for everyone to see it as a way of inflicting terror, or the alternative is they try to make the person disappear. That's what happened to Emmett Till. His body was recovered, but that was not their intention. That was not a KKK murder, it was an extremist murder. The same happened to 3 civil rights workers who were found in a dam, I believe in Mississippi, during Freedom Summer. The part where the extremists stage it to look like an accident, I'm not sure if we've seen that in the 20th century. So in other words, Douglas Harris's death scene did not fit any known patterns of extremist-related homicide. Another possible suspect was an individual named Paul T. Schlau Jr., who lived from 1917 to 1977. This individual is the Ruley family's favorite suspect for the death of Douglas Harris and Ellis Ruley. Mr. Schlau and his wife bought property at 22 Hammond Avenue in 1947 and started constructing a house there. Mr. Schlau's relationship with Ellis Ruley shortly thereafter started going very badly. He was a territorial individual with a temper, and he also had issues with Ellis Ruley for racial reasons. Nevertheless, you can't just simply assume that he had anything to do with the deaths because they had a bad neighbor relationship. Otherwise, hundreds of people would be dying in Norwich on a regular basis. So we have to try to establish facts that tend to either exclude him or include him. And some of the information I found was that it appears he did not move into that house until 1949 after Douglas Harris's death. The first assessor's card was created in the summer of 1949. Douglas died in November of 1948. They did not even have power in the property, which means that he could not have been working on the property after dark very easily on the night that Douglas Harris died. Similarly, using school records, I found that as of September 1st, 1948, his son was living at 425 East Main Street. So the reason why this is important is because if Douglas Harris is killed near or on the property, then if Mr. Schlau assaults him, it's not on the physical property. It's someplace else, maybe on East Main Street, and then you have the issue of transporting the body back to the property. There are some other problems with the assumption. I never had a report, even second or third hand, regarding how Paul T. Schlau and Douglas Harris would have interacted. I suspect they would have not gotten along, but that's not good enough for an investigation. I don't have an actual description of them being on bad terms. The other thing, too, was that Mr. Schlau's son, who is also named Paul, and who is a boy when Douglas Harris died, he told Glenn Smith that his father told him that Douglas Harris had been found sitting at the bottom of the well looking up. This is totally at odds with what was actually discovered on the site when the police arrived. And this would tend to indicate that Paul T. Schlau Jr. did not have firsthand knowledge of what happened that night. What makes this interesting is that this individual would later tell another individual that there had been a fight on the property that evening. How he ever got that information, I don't know. But he might have heard it from someone, he might not have, but it's an unanswered question. I can just tell you that the case for the elder Paul Schlau having committed this murder is not particularly good. The facts are not fitting together well. Other possible suspects. Well, it's possible that a family member had something to do with Douglas Harris's death. But if you say that, then you need to establish which family member. Ironically, Marion Harris had a clean criminal record in Norwich while she lived here. She lived here on and off for a great part of her life, and at least between 1929 and 1956, she had no criminal offenses. Ellis, who was also on the property, had 4 offenses, but they were generally alcohol-related, small scale. There was a couple breach of peace and a DWI. There was nothing in his own criminal record which would strongly indicate that he had a propensity for violence. Finally, Ellis W. Ruley's brothers had more serious problems with the law. And I did look at them as possible suspects, but the problem is with that theory is he had multiple brothers, only one was still alive in 1948. And Harry Ruley Sr., who had his own troubles, did not seem to be hanging out with Ellis very much based on his own criminal arrests. They never got arrested together. I can't say that, another family member was necessarily involved based on the inferential information I have. So what are my conclusions about Douglas Harris's death? Well, the first thing is, if the Ruley family had nothing to do with it, they would have likely still had a good idea who was behind it because Norwich was such a tight-knit community at the time. Because of Douglas Harris's previous legal troubles and those of other family members and the racial climate at the time, the family might have decided not to tell the Norwich Police Department what happened. I've essentially come to the end of what circumstantial inferences I can make about the identity of the person or persons who likely killed Douglas Harris. It is also possible that there was someone out there who murdered them who I have no idea of and did not show up in my investigation. So I cannot conclusively identify the perpetrators to the extent an arrest would be made on the information I now have in my possession.